Well, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Megan and we can begin. Megan McDermott is a priest associate and a director of creative formation at Grace Episcopal Church in Amherst, Massachusetts, where she has served since 2018. When studying for her MDiv at Yale, Megan was also a student of the Institute of Sacred Music, an interdisciplinary program dedicated to religion and the arts. A published poet, Megan's writings have appeared in a variety of journals and online publications, including the Christian Century, Fair Forward, Episcopal Cafe, and Spiritus, a journal of Christian spirituality. She is the author of 2 clap books, which are mini collections of poetry, and a forthcoming full-length collection, Jesus Merch, a catalog and poems, due out in late 2022 or early 2023 from Quaker publisher Fernwood Press. And I will turn it over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Lene. I'm going to pull up a screen share right now because I'll have some images to kind of show as we go along. So hopefully everyone can see that okay. So before I really get started, wanted to talk a little bit more about who I am and what my background is. So like Lene said, I've been in parish ministry here at Grace Episcopal Church, which is in my Zoom background, in Amherst, Massachusetts for 4 years now, first as their curate, and then as a priest associate. And then I also have this background in writing. So creative writing was always kind of my passion way before I started thinking about ministry. And as a college student, I majored in creative writing at Susquehanna University, which is a little Lutheran liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. And there I really discovered poetry as the primary way that I was interested in writing and in reading. And at the same time, while I was there, I discovered the Episcopal Church and started thinking about ordination. And so when I was in seminary, I remember having a lot of questions about, was there really any place or connection between my kind of creative interests and what parish life as a priest would be like, especially since at the time I was working for some ecumenical worship services and doing all sorts of odd things in worship, which is a bit more difficult to do if you're using the Book of Common Prayer. So I've been really pleased that through kind of these first few years of parish ministry, I've found some ways to use that passion for art and literature in parish work. But the real gift for me so far, and what I hope kind of comes through in this talk, is that it's ended up feeling natural. Like I've been very conscious of not wanting to just impose like, oh, I love poetry and I love art, so now everyone has to love poetry and art like I do, but rather finding ways to really offer those passions that connect with the needs and curiosities of people in the parish. So I used this title, Providing New Doorways, because the way that I'm thinking about art and literature in the parish, incorporating it isn't an end goal in and of itself, but it's always about what does this potentially open up in those who engage with these opportunities? How can this piece of art or literature or whatever it may be how can it be an entryway into something, whether that's personal discussion, spiritual discussion, or just a deeper connection with a passage of scripture or with God. So with that little intro, I'm just going to dive into some of the ways that I've been doing that work in Amherst. So I would say arts and literature hasn't always been a focal point, but it's definitely something since the beginning of my time at Grace that I've worked on incorporating into various things that I do. So what that might have been, an adult ed class on poems and art that I offered in Advent my first year. Pre-COVID, I did 2 annual kind of readings featuring writers at Grace. And a lot of times I'm drawing on arts and literature in youth group or Sunday school or our youth confirmation classes. So the example I'm about to show, I believe is back in 2020 or 2021 when my youth group was all on Zoom. So we did a couple sessions that I called Stations of the Resurrection. And we looked at the different Bible passages that show the resurrected Jesus and kind of dove into the stories and discussed them. And for each story, I found different pieces of art. So this is the dinner at Emmaus where Jesus is revealed. So these are a few of the pieces we looked at. I especially love this one on the left called Yummaeus, and it's set, at a contemporary fast food restaurant, which I find very fascinating. And what I did with these pieces of art was usually just simply ask the kids who showed up, like, which is your favorite painting? And I found that just asking that opened up so much, because as they were describing, well, I like this one because of whatever, you would really see how they were thinking about and processing the scripture story and what to them was the most important part of that. So this is one way, just kind of in youth ministry, I've kind of used art to spur conversation. For the past 2 confirmation classes, I've used this poem by the poet Abigail Carroll called Creed, towards the beginning of the year when we're talking about, what does it mean to believe in something and to answer in the baptismal covenant, all these things that you believe. And I won't read the whole poem, but she kind of lists, all these things that she believes in. I believe in salt thick ancient seas, the absoluteness of blue, or I believe in the audacity of light, the patience of cedars, and the poem goes on. And so I've used that with our high schoolers, one, to just hear their reactions to the poem, but also to ask them, if you were listing out things that you believe in, what would be on that list for you? And then moving into, if you were listing things you believed in about God, what would that look like? So those are just a few examples. But I think the way I was thinking about art and literature in the church really shifted during the pandemic. And so, like a lot of churches, in 2020, we weren't worshiping together in person. And we were really trying to figure out, what are the ways that we maintain connection with one another and let people know, like, we are still here. Our community is still here. Your clergy are still here. We want to pray for you. We want to support you however we can. And credit for this idea goes to our rector, Tom Synan, who said, when the church first physically closed, I want people to hear from us every day. And we're going to send them a daily prayer email every day that would have a prayer, a poem, or something else inspirational. And then I didn't include it on the slides, but it also had kind of prayer requests specific to our community. So people's birthdays and prayers for healing. And then, any announcements or updates about just the status of church life during COVID. And so he and I both were scouring books and the internet for appropriate prayers and poems. And as time went on and we realized, oh, this is not going to be 2 weeks, we invited people from the congregation to share with us, what are prayers or poems that are meaningful to you that you might want to share with the congregation. Our parish administrator got in on the search. And I will say it was one of the most time consuming things that we did. And also when I look back at that earlier pandemic time, I still feel like it was one of the most meaningful things that we did, even though it's such a simple concept. And there were probably some people in the congregation who were like, I don't need an email every day. But the number of people we got, who would reach out to us when they connected with a prayer or a poem, or who were wanting to share with us the poems or prayers they loved, or, the number of people who were telling us, oh, I'm printing these out and giving them to my granddaughter, or I'm forwarding this email to my niece or whatever. It just felt like this is connecting in some way to what people are looking for. And it gave them a reason to reach out to us, I think, without having to kind of say, oh, I'm lonely or depressed in the pandemic or struggling. It gave people something to respond to. And for me, I think I started to shift how I was seeing art and literature in the congregation as like, this is not just a fun thing that I'm passionate about that can like supplement what we're doing, but instead, maybe this is actually something our community really needs, especially in the midst of, a tough time where you're craving, inspiration. And I think sometimes poetry or art can meet that in a different way than more traditional prayer language can, especially if someone's prayer life or feels like it's running dry, that it provides another entryway into meaning or significance. So in 2021, in the summer, my title at Grace changed to include, it went from priest associate to priest associate and director for creative formation. And we kind of shared that with people as, this is a signal that I'm going to intentionally kind of continue this work of providing opportunities around arts and literature to help people in the development of their lives of faith. And so since summer 2021, I've really kind of been actively looking for more opportunities to do that in our congregation. And that's come to look like a lot of different things. I've done classes. I offered a class in fall 2021 on poetry and praise, where we both read poetry together and discussed it. And then we also had people do some writing of their own. And up on the screen, and I can send slides to anyone who wants to look at anything more closely later. But up on the screen is one of the writing prompts that we used. And I find every time I have people do writing prompts and then give them time to share, I always think people are going to be too nervous to share. And I think maybe that's projecting my baggage from like having been in writing workshops in academic settings. But people are usually always more willing to share than I think they will be. And I am just always very honored and astounded at like how much it opens up people to talk about their personal lives or their personal understanding of spirituality or faith. And I think it's because when you're writing or you're making a thing, it becomes a little more approachable than just asking someone, oh, can you like tell us all your thoughts on this? So in a way, it kind of leads people into a personal space without making the emphasis entirely on them, which I have found to be pretty valuable. I've also experimented with different ways of using it in worship, primarily outside of our Sunday morning, though obviously you could incorporate these things into Sundays as well. So these pictures are from a contemplative midweek service we did last Advent that I called Space for Your Spirit. And it was all about offering a variety of ways for people to engage in contemplation and meditation, and often in response to art or poetry. So each week we just had one scripture passage that we focused on, and I'd provide usually some visual art that intersected with that scripture in some way. So what's on the screen is different mountain artwork. We did a passage from Malachi that used a phrase about the mountain of the Lord. So this was kind of inviting people to think, what do you envision when you hear mountain of the Lord? And I always would have kind of a ton of poetry and quotes spread out on a bench that people could grab whatever interested them. So on the screen right now, we had a week where we talked about the gospel passage where Jesus says, in my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. And so I found a bunch of poems and quotes that in some way had something to say about the idea of home. So I found, among other things, this poem by Ada Limon, where she talks about how she thinks about home when she's traveling, and has these beautiful lines. Then I think of you home with the dog, the field full of purple pop-ups. We're small and flawed, but I want to be who I am, going where I'm going all over again. And I really like the idea of providing these variety of art and poetry avenues into meditation in a contemplative space, because I think it gives people something to latch on to who may not be the most comfortable with silence, which I'll admit is sometimes me. I can find it difficult to, just be in the silence, but to have something to put my reflection towards, I often find helpful. But what I've really been focusing on lately have been Zoom meditations, which I offer usually over Mondays at lunch at 12:15 p.m. I try to kind of keep them 25 minutes-ish. And it started with a Lent series that I called The Cross Through Artist Eyes. And so we did a bunch of different artists, Georgia O'Keeffe, Marc Chagall, some contemporary artists. And each week we would look at a number of pieces they did of the cross or crucifixion. I'd do a brief introduction to the artist, and then I would kind of share the pieces one by one through screen share, like I'm doing right now, provide a few questions for prayer and meditation, and then I would pull up a slide or two with all the pieces together and some background music, and everyone would have usually 3 or 4 minutes to just have time on their own reflecting, and then we would talk about it after. And these are 2 pieces by the artist William H. Johnson. And this is just an example of what a question slide looked like. I won't read those questions, but every week I tended to ask, what do these images bring to mind? How do you experience them? Do they inspire a similar or different reaction than the crucifixes or crosses you might see in a church space? And so the time after all that, after everyone had the individual time, we came back together for group discussion. And again, I found that to be the most valuable part, because people, in sharing their reactions and emotions to the art, often what's coming up is how they think about the cross and how they think about Jesus. And I found particularly exploring the cross through art to be helpful, because the cross can be really tricky theologically. Like, there's a lot of complexity, I think, in understanding how do we think about the violence of the cross? How do we understand atonement? How do we understand salvation? And to approach it through art and creativity gives people a chance to connect to the cross from a different place, perhaps an emotional space rather than a thinking space, which isn't to devalue theological study or conversation, but just to say, I think art can sometimes give you a different connection point that's helpful. And so after that Lent series did well, I decided, oh, I should just keep using this time in general format. So over the summer, every Monday, I did a poem and prayer Zoom gathering. We would read one poem. I would give like an 8-minute talk on it, and then I would bring up some questions and give people time to reflect on their own. So this is a short poem by Maggie Smith. And you can see some of the questions are things like, what's an ending you're dealing with that connects to this poem's message, and how does it connect? The poem is the author reflecting on something her daughter says about trees. So one of the questions is there anything someone in your life has said to you lately that perhaps felt meaningful in a way that they didn't intend? So we would go off, everyone would have their own time with the poem. And again, when we came back together, I was often really honored by just the personal reactions that people would share. And again, I think it helps to give people, it's something they're responding to. They get to respond to the poem, and in the process, bring themselves into that, but are not necessarily being told, and now is the time where you talk about yourself, or now's the time where you talk about what's going on in your spiritual life. And I recently, that was for the summer, and the past few weeks I've been doing something very similar with both poetry and visual art that speaks to the sacredness of the body in some way. So that's been called Holy Physicality, and I will probably do an Advent series over the same time of poetry. So that was a lot of examples I threw at you. And you're probably wondering, what is the takeaway? And how, if you wanted to, would you start incorporating art and literature more into your faith community? And I think a lot of it comes down to, what are the small ways you can bring poetry and art into what you're already doing, whether that's in a sermon or in a Bible study, sharing a poem that relates to the passage, or if you're doing a lesson for youth or adults, is there an interesting piece of visual art that you can bring along and add to the conversation? And I think when you start doing those small things, then you get a sense of, is this connecting with my community, and is there a hunger for more of this? But before all of that, I think a lot goes back to, your own personal exposure to literature and art that feeds your soul and might end up being relevant for other people. And of course, the time we all have to devote to reading is different, whether that's our personal time or our work time that you're counting. But however much time or amount that you have, I think in terms of faith formation work and connections, you get more out of it when you're able to have some sort of system for recording or saving the things that strike you. So for me, I use this website Tumblr that I originally started using, back in college just to blog. But since then, I have kind of used to keep quotes from essentially every book I read. I go back and I look at my underlines and I think, do I want to have this to go back to later? And the thing about Tumblr that I appreciate is you can do tags. So you can go back later and find things. So what I have on the screen right now is my Adam and Eve tag. So there's a poem I put in a week ago about Adam and Eve. But if I click on Adam and Eve, I also then see, oh, here's a quote about Adam and Eve from a book of poetry I read 7 months ago. And so the next slide is the suffering tag. So a poem I read, and I thought, oh, this is about suffering. I'm sure I'm going to talk about suffering at church at some point. So I can look at that tag and see, oh, here's a poem about Job from 4 months ago. Oh, and here's another poem by Ada Limon. And I'm not advocating everyone gets on Tumblr, but I think you can do your own system with a journal, on paper, in a Word document. But I think the key is just to have something you can turn to besides just looking up at your bookshelves, which are filled with things, and finding something that's relevant. Because I think often the poem or art that can work is often something you've already read. And if you're completely wondering, where do I start finding, poetry or literature that might speak to faith or spiritual questions, I cannot speak highly enough of these devotionals by Sarah Arthur. There's one for ordinary time, one for Advent, Light Upon Light, if you're looking for that coming up. And there's one for Lent, Between Midnight and Dawn. And she every week has a number of poems and often an excerpt from a novel that speaks to the themes of the season. And so in general, I think anthologies are really helpful if you're just wanting to know more about what's out there. And that way there will be some poems you dislike and some you like, and you can explore the poets that speak to you. You can go seek out more of their work. And I just also compiled a few websites that I can send this slide to people by email if you want. But for visual art, there's this website, artandtheology.org, that I use constantly and look up scripture passages or theological words and can usually find art there. Visual Commentary on Scripture has multiple pieces of art for different passages. And the library at Vanderbilt Div School, they have a database of art in the Christian tradition as well, where you can search by scripture usually, or by term. And there are also websites out there that specifically gather poetry that they think is helpful for preachers and ministers, like the Journey with Jesus website. In Flesh is kind of a progressive Christian organization that publishes some poetry and blessings. And A Sanctified Art is another kind of Christian organization that they do a lot of visual art resources for congregations, but they also do some poetry for worship as well. So those are just a few starting points, and I will stop screen sharing for now, and I think we move into some discussion.
Comments, questions?
First of all, I just want to say thank you. Thank you. This is really lovely, and the richness of the resources. The one early on where the woman wrote a poem to the floater. I thought that was it was so personal and so universal. It's so specific. So thank you for sharing that. And I wondered as you were going through it, do you get a lot of people coming?
So
Yeah, what's your participation?
yeah, I would say the Lent series was probably the most popular over Zoom. I would say we were often getting like 15 or so people on like a Monday over lunch. And I would say the summer group probably had more people than I'm getting right now, just because I think people are more free over the summer. So I would say summer was usually about 10 people on Zoom, around 12, 15. And now I would say anywhere between like 8 and 12 people I'm getting. But it's more than in Lent, I was astounded by the amount of people who were showing up, because it was a time of day and over Zoom, and I was like, I don't know if people are gonna want to do this on Zoom over lunch. So I have been pleasantly surprised with the amount of people, but yeah. And now I think it's kind of developed into like more of a core group who this is one of their things at church that they feel fed by.
Are you, well, I'm sure you're familiar with Poetry Foundation.
Yes.
And for the rest of you, if you look up Poetry Foundation, you can find poems on just about any topic you can possibly imagine. Just put a word in, and they also have a randomizer which you can just play around with, which is really fun.
Oh, and that's making me realize I was going to add to my list, and I forgot the podcast Poetry Unbound by Padre Gotuma. It's through On Being, and it's usually like 10 minutes, and I totally stole my the format of my poetry meditations from him, except what I do is more interactive because it's people on Zoom. But he'll read one poem and then he'll offer a reflection on it. And he is a poet, but he also has a theology background. So his approach to the poems are often pretty spiritual. And it just is another source to get introduced to some interesting poems. And he really, I think, makes the poems accessible in a way, and kind of opens them up for people. So it's a big model to me of, I think, how I try to approach poems in ministry, because I think poetry can sometimes be very perplexing, and that's not what I'm I'm not trying to perplex people on purpose. I'm hoping that I am giving enough context to not explain the whole poem, but to get people started in their own exploration of it.
Are you familiar with Lily Lewin's free range worship?
No.
She's I think her background is Methodist. She's in Nashville. But if you look up free range worship, she does really creative worship kinds of things. And she's done she's done some things on Zoom that are really, really interesting. Have you done anything with popular music?
No, I haven't really done as much music stuff. But I think there's a lot there. I just, a couple months ago, we have a young adult retreat in the Diocese of Western Mass, and some of the one of the Episcopal Service Corps interns led a meditation on a song by Mitski. I'm like, that's her name, right? On a popular artist. And I was really struck by that. It was very effective. It's not something I've done a lot of, but I think there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, some of the Imagine Dragons songs would be wonderful. The lyrics are very poetic, and it struck me they would be interesting. Has anybody done something like this, or are you inspired to do it?
I can share. Is there feedback when I'm talking though?
No.
Just checking. All right. On my phone, there tends to be feedback, so I figured I would check.
You're good.
When I was in campus ministry, we used to do this like on our retreats with our students. We'd always have like an art table in the back, and they could, and like throughout every time of speaking and of singing and scripture reading, they would be able to just create things and worship God through art that way. And we would frequently have somebody, there was one person that kind of volunteered with us. Her name was Sarah Dresser. She's one of my good friends. And she does this now like as her full-time job in ministry around the world. And she would go on our retreats, she would go up front and have like her easel set up and just live paint through the service. And just worship God that way. And it was really, really great to be able to see this thing come to life, while you were learning and while you were singing and praying. And now she all over the world will go and works with a lot of, she works mostly like in different like Southeast Asian countries, spending a lot of time there in different Eastern African countries. And she'll do different kinds of like art programs to teach kids how to really express their feelings and their thoughts and their dreams and their love of God through art. And it's really interesting to follow her and see the things she's doing. But it's always been very impactful that I've seen in my life, and especially in our college students, that they really enjoyed it. I think it's something that would be great that we could bring in more with adults.
Jacqueline, you just made me realize, and I don't think I really consciously was thinking about this as an influence, but when I was a student in campus ministry, we used to do all the time, I think it was called Solario. It was like these pack of cards of like various photos of random things, and you would kind of spread them out, and there were questions we would ask people. You would like set up in public or on campus somewhere, and it was like, which of these, pick 3 photos that like represent your day, and then pick what you think represents God or your relationship with God. I haven't really thought about that, but I think that's a lot of had to have been an influence in thinking about art as a conversation starter.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it would like it would get people to talking about things that I think if we had just asked them, what do you think about God? What do you think God is like? It's so open-ended that to give people something visual to respond to, I think it helps the flow of the conversation at times.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we did was, what's your dream? And at Fitchburg State University, and we had a big canvas out, and then a bunch of different paints, and then like multimedia things as well. So they could like stick something on or glue something on, or they could paint it on, or they could just like use a Sharpie and write it on. And it was one big painting that all of these students who were just passing through the student center throughout the entire morning would just stop and add something like, here's my dream. And it was a vast array of things that they were dreaming about for the future in their lives. It was really great.
Hey, Megan. I left the church at 7 o'clock, and I'm now pulled over at the parking lot in McDonald's. Listen to you, and I just really applaud what you're doing. And the church has always been connected to the arts, and I think we've kind of lost that in recent years. And so I'm really grateful to you for making that connection again. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. I hope you're getting some fries or something.
No, just listening to you.
Oh, well, thank
But
you.
thank you for doing this, and this is all being recorded, so others are going to hear this later. So thank you for this.
Thank you. Well, and the Bible is like great literature too. So it's like, and so much of literature is inspired by scripture or by religious or spiritual questions. So like you're saying, Doug, I think there's all these natural relationships between these things. And we have not been helped by, there are a lot of times that arts have been pitted against each other. And it was honestly very interesting in college as a creative writing major. I got a lot of negative, not a lot, but I occasionally would get negative reactions to the fact that I was writing about religion. And I was always checking with my friends who weren't religious to be like, I really don't feel like I was preaching there, was I? And they were like, no, you were fine. But because it's such a personal topic, I think for people that people were surprised sometimes to like, oh, you're writing a poem referencing the Bible, when in reality that's, you know, so much of poetry and literature has been that. But I've been very pleasantly surprised since then that I think there's a lot of space in the literary world right now for writing that explores faith and doubt and spirituality. And there are a lot of publications that are specifically doing that work. And I think it's very important because people's perception is often that Christian art or Christian writing is inferior. And I think there's a lot in popular culture that is not always great, but there's also a lot of art rooted in Christian faith that is really beautiful and complex and honest. And I think that's the main thing, dealing with art that is honest and not performative.
Yeah. And you're really engaged in that world. So I'm really grateful for you.
I remember having a conversation with my son when he was in high school. He was reading for a class, he was reading Toni Morrison's Beloved. And we started talking about the fact that the very title comes from the Bible and taking off from there. And this was a kid who was reasonably biblically literate. And yet he had missed that. And once he did, he went back and read the Song of Songs and started putting pieces together in a new and different way. I think people have missed the biblical references so often in literature. They just miss it because they don't know the Bible enough to catch it. So, Lori, do you have anything you want to throw in?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you. I'm never have really thought of myself as a huge fan of poetry. I do love art, but the reason I joined the group tonight was because I'm involved in children's ministry at my church, St. Mark's in Leominster, and also part of a subgroup of the vestry that's talking about forming small group, because we haven't done that at St. Mark's. I've been there about 6 or 7 years, and I guess maybe 20 years or so ago they did have very successful small group formations, and so we're looking at redoing that, putting that back together, a program starting hopefully early in the year. And I think a lot of the ideas that you shared tonight would be wonderful in eliciting conversation in those groups, and also maybe, eliciting interesting discussion with the children, even in Sunday school classes. So,
And I have your email, Lori, so I will email you the slides.
yeah.
Saw that in the chat.
So, but I'm talking about literature too. I mean, even literature that doesn't even include any biblical references. I find myself when I'm reading a novel or something that kind of putting into context for the character when you get into a book that, where there's really good character development on. A lot of times there's a lot of things going on in their lives, and trying to think of, well, if I were their friend and trying to counsel them from a biblical perspective, what would I say to them? What scripture would be relevant in the context of the situation that they're narrating? So my mind always seems to go in that direction when I'm reading a book.
Yeah, so many of the poems and the visual art that I use, like I don't necessarily know what the author's religious background is. It might be no religious background. It might be a completely different one. But yeah, there is, I think any writing that is, insightful and, captures something about the human condition, we can bring into conversation, right, with our faith and how our faith leads us to think about things. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's a big point too, that it's not just art that articulates something Christian that can help us engage spiritually. It's, I think, any art that really is dealing with something honest about what it's like to be a person, and that we can engage with.
It's something that kind of speaks to your soul and your heart. So I think the art, doing something like the solarium we were describing with the cards or pictures, a group of pictures, to elicit conversation with children about a Bible lesson, I think is a wonderful idea. I'm definitely going to pursue that.
Vibrant Faith has cards like that available.
What was that called again?
Vibrant Faith. I'd have to look up.
Vibrant Faith.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Lori, many, I grew up in Leominster, Lori. I grew up going to the Pilgrim Congregational Church, but after I became an Episcopalian, I went to St. Mark's for a year. So it was nice to hear that it's, that there's good old St. Mark's, a lovely church, lovely church.
Yes, it is.
Before I was a teacher, before I was a nurse, I was a teacher. And with seventh graders, I did a unit on the Bible as literature, because we were studying ancient history, and we were studying the whole Near East. And so I remember we did the structure of Psalms, and Psalms are really fun to do with kids, and to talk about the poetry of repetition, which is what Psalms use. And so I remember I had all the kids write Psalms, and I wrote one. I don't remember much about them, but I do remember that mine started out was blessed are the scholars who pass their homework in on time. But we had, I remember there were some about, blessed is baseball practice, and but it was a nice way to get them involved with that.
That's a good idea too. So thank you for sharing that. So, and come visit us at St. Mark's again sometime.
Thank you.
I wonder what it would be like, and I do this all the time, I think out loud. I wonder what it would be like to hand out sticky notes during church and ask everybody to write a line of a psalm and put them in the offering plate and stick them all together at the end.
That's a great idea.
That people could, so that everybody could be involved. And, give them a theme, and then let people off the hook, let them do what they want to do. Have you had people do a lot of any writing in your workshops, Megan?
Yeah, when I did the poems and praise class, that had a lot of writing. And I haven't done as much of it with the meditations, because it just feels like something I need a little bit more time to do. But whenever I have done it, I've always felt like it was such a valuable thing to get people writing. And I did a youth group session. When was this? Maybe last Lent, where we talked about writing as a way of self-examination, being in touch with yourself. And I had them do some writing as well, which also, again, I don't know why I always assume no one's going to want to share their writing. And, there were these teenage boys ready to be like, I'll read my poem, Megan. So I think when I do have people write, I usually try to give pretty specific prompts and like give them permission to like not use it if they want. But I think I definitely try to err towards the side of like giving them more to go off of, so it feels approachable for people who haven't done as much kind of creative writing or journaling before. And I'm thinking right now, I was just talking to Will Heron, who works for Province One, but also does young adult stuff here in the diocese, of potentially doing a spiritual writing for Advent thing on Zoom for young adults. And like Advent's coming up, so I really have to get it nailed down and figure out if I'm doing it. But the Diocese of North Carolina has, I think it's called Gather to Write, and I can find the link if anyone wants it. But they've published a set of sessions on spiritual writing with like prompts responding to Advent, and it looks great. They did all the work for you and putting it together. Maybe I can find it quick if anyone wants it.
St. Matthew's about 7 years ago started doing daily meditations written by the members.
Oh, wow.
And publishing them on their Facebook page and sending them out on a daily basis. It's kind of petered out this year, but we still get probably a dozen a month from various people. And they've also included pictures, photographs. We had one woman who's now in her 90s, so she doesn't anymore, but she would go out in her backyard and take pictures of the birds in her backyard and write a little line or two to go with them. And those have been really wonderful, both in terms of the content, but also getting to know one another and sharing our faith with each other. And those have gone literally all over the world. We've had one of them, we got a comment from Paris, France. And it was like, really? How did it get there? But those things happen when you put them out there. You never know where they're going to go or who they're going to touch.
I like that idea of sharing on the social media too. And also we have a monthly church newsletter. And when you were talking about earlier, inviting people to share poetry or art or things that move them, that might be a good place to introduce like a sharing section in our monthly newsletter as well. So,
Yeah.
and maybe even invite some of the children to put together. That'd be a great thing to take that idea you were talking about with the sticky notes and the compilation of that. That would be something terrific to share, because it's all anonymous. So I think that encourages people. That aspect would encourage people to share more openly, is that it's all anonymous, and then to put that all together and publish it on a Facebook page or in a newsletter or something would be really interesting.
Yeah.
I think, and welcome for people to read. So thought provoking.
It's one of those things, you try it and see if it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and you don't do it again.
Yeah. So, but these are all great ideas.
Yeah.
So,
Anybody else?
I apologize for bouncing around. I'm using a cell phone in my
Yeah,
arm.
figured.
I just want to thank Megan. Megan is a great gift to our diocese. So thank you so much for this and for all the other things you do. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, Bishop Dick.
Yeah.
And
Thanks for taking the time to join us.
yes, thank you, Lene, for inviting me and having me come. And it's some of my favorite stuff that I get to do. So I am honored to get to share it with other people.
And I'm glad we recorded this, and lots of other people will see this. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's just delightful.
Yeah.
Lots of good ideas.
These conversations happen every month, not during the summer, but every month during the program year. There are different topics, different people all over the map, pretty much. But next month, I am really excited because one of the people I have looked up to for years, who has greatly influenced my view of how to do formation, is going to be with us from California, Gretchen Mueller-Nelson. She wrote a book called Dance with God, which came out in the 1990s and talks about how to incorporate spirituality into home life and into children's lives and into families' lives. And it changed completely how I thought of formation. And so December 15th, 7 p.m.
Thank you.
If you have a chance to come listen to her, she's going to talk about St. Nicholas and how that fits into our world today. So she's amazing. And she's a grande dame of formation, and I hope you can come join us.
Thank you.
So, well,
Oh,
does anybody else have? Go ahead.
They're just I'm signing off. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Megan, for a great
thank
presentation.
you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. I'm sorry I won't be able to join you on the 15th. My grandson is in revels in Cambridge, and I have
Well, that's important.
it's dress rehearsal, and I'm the parental figure that night there. So
It will be recorded. So
yeah, thank you so much, Megan. And it was nice to meet you, Lori from St. Mark's. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yes, great
Lenny.
to meet
Be
you
with
all.
you
Thank
all.
Thank you.
you so much.
Nice to meet you all.
Bye. Have a good night.
Good night.